It's of course, an honor to present here. So, and thank you for really a warm, nice introduction. So, I'm Audris, Mockus, so I'm at the University of Tennessee. I'm also part-time at Meta, but this work is not related, so I'm not putting that affiliation here. So let me go over some outline. So there's a variety of things that I like to cover, so I'll try to be fairly fast. So if anything, you stop me if it's not clear. So first, I'll describe what I mean by software supply chains. The word is used, but abused a lot, so I'll try to explain what it is. I'll try to explain how large language models result in yet another type of software supply chain. Then talk about how to detect if LLM output contains bugs, how to fix automatically these bugs at scale, how to recognize a little bit about generated code, approaches to reduce data leakages, and also mention very briefly that LLMs have their own supply chain. These models are used, the models are used to train on data, et cetera, et cetera. So let's jump into what supply chains are. So the concept of supply chain is really about risk management. It came from regular kind of production environments where Coca-Cola sources some sort of plant material in one little community somewhere in South America. And if the rainforest is destroyed there, Coca-Cola cannot make their stuff anymore, right? So there's a big risk concentrated there. There's another supply chains you heard about during U.S. decided not to let China make microchips, and so we had to pay 3 times more for cars because cars could not be produced because they had a lot of chips from China, right? So these are supply chain things, right? So but software is actually different than materials. It's really easy to transport it. You don't have transport networks, and so forth. So the meaning of supply chain is different, and there are different actually meanings in which you can apply the supply chain concept for different risks. So supply chain of first kind, what I call is technical dependencies among projects. Basically, you import some library, framework, etc., and then that means that you depend on something. Like when you depend on something, there's 2 things that could happen. One thing is that the people who maintain the stuff that you depend are too lazy or too eager, right? So if they're too lazy, they don't fix bugs, they stop maintaining stuff, and so you're stuck with software that's no longer adapted to the environment, right? If they're too eager, they add some features that break your software. So both of these are pretty serious risks, right? So if you, now, second kind of supply chain is not something that people actually recognize, even though it stares in your face. We talk about open source. In open source, you can take any code and use it somewhere else. Whether it's allowed or not, that's a different story, but you can always actually take and use it. So in this case, the primary risks are license compliance. Perhaps the code has different license than your project. Another thing is that once you take ownership of the code, vendor it essentially, you're basically stuck with it. So if somebody else fixes bugs, you don't know about that, right? So if somebody adds new features, you don't know about that. So that's your job, right? So these typically have people start with some sort of complex algorithms they don't want to re-implement themselves. They use good templates, configuration files, etc. So there's a lot of copying going on. There's a third kind of supply chain, which even less recognized, which is a knowledge supply chain. Whenever you work on a project, you say, oh, this loop is really, really cute. I'm going to use it somewhere else, right? Or I really like this new framework or this testing tool or build tool, right? So then you work on another project, you use the same idea there, right? So some of these things are good practices, some of them are bad. Whatever it is, you actually spread them, right? So the primary risk with knowledge supply chain is that a person might implement most 90% of the project, but then for whatever reason they leave, right? And it's in their idea, they can maintain it, but nobody else really understand what's going on, sort of like with my papers. Sorry about referring to that. So that's kind of the risk there. So let me introduce a little bit what World of Code is, because it allows you to measure these at least 3 types of supply chains and perhaps others. So this is a brief introduction. So the first thing is in order to measure supply chain, you really need to collect as much data as possible, because if you're missing some nodes and links, you're really not seeing the full supply chain. So, so currently, as of the sort of August version of the World of Code, there's about 26 billion blobs, 20 billion trees, 5 billion commits. For comparison, another large repository, Software Heritage, has about 4 billion commits, so it's about 20% more than there. So it's also not just a collection of data, it's curated. So there's things like hard things that are very hard to do at scale, like author aliasing, report deforking, bot identification, whatever. A bunch of stuff is calculated. The third thing is that there's lots of data. Having data is not enough to do analysis, so it's cross-reference indexed in a way that you can actually quickly do a lot of analysis. Now, here's how it looks. On the left side, you have detection of new updated projects. Then these are cloned. Then objects are extracted, commits, trees, and blobs, then reorganized. And on the right, you have basically these maps that you can use to do sort of a measurement of the supply chain. That's really what it is. So if we see how it applies, how it helps with the first kind supply chain, basically, it parses these blobs, extracts import statements, so we can map actually every import statement in every version of every file to a specific blob commit project, so we have time information, author, project information. Some languages have also export statements, so these are also mapped. So we can have this kind of no need for package managers to sort of understand where where code is implemented and where code is used. As far as supply chain of second kind, copying, that's the one that's actually not really industry does not recognize it as such because you really need to have complete collection in order to use it. So that's copying of code from project to project. So in the world of code, there are indexes that originate basically have for each blob originating project, target project, time of first copy. There's actually, as I mentioned, there's 26 billion blobs, right? So that's all our raw data. 23 billion instances of reuse where a blob was copied, right? So it's not all the blobs are copied, but significant number of blobs are copied. 31 million projects that have originating block, 86 million have destination. And these are deforked projects, by the way, so we're not talking about forks here. So as far as SSC of third kind, World of Code has more limited means, but there's authors, alias authors mapped to various APIs, commits, blobs, etc. So we can at least see where a person participated in, what sort of exposure they had, and then see if they actually used any of that exposure to contaminate or improve the next projects they worked on. Now, so here's the little picture. I'm not a big fan of pictures, but here's a little picture of, so these on the diagonal, you have these blobs, versions of the source code, and you have knowledge transfer where a person read or modified some file, then learned about it, then transferred that information to another file. Another person, another developer maybe copied information from one file to another. Third developer maybe learned from that file and sort of transferred some information somewhere else. So that's kind of a traditional supply chain. Okay, so, okay.
So quick clarification.
Yeah.
Did you say that out of 26 billion blobs, 23 billion were copied?
No, 23 billion copies. It's actually about 7% of the 26 billion blobs have been copied. So when you have a copy, there's a lot of copying. Now, what I would like to do is to try to see why the PC died, and it's not allowing me to switch to the next. Okay. Okay. So yeah, okay. Okay.
Just a clarification.
Okay. Good. So, so there it is. Okay.
Just a
did I
question.
answer your question?
I have one here.
Yeah.
Here. Okay.
Yes.
So my question is about what a copy really means. Is it somehow related to code cloning or not?
Right. So it's related to code cloning, but it's related in a way that entire file there's an identical version of the So each file has multiple versions, right? So there's a version of a file here and a version of another file. So the file name could be totally different, but the actual content is identical, right? There's a way to do approximate copying detection, but that's, of course, much more costly because of when you have 26 billion square, you really need locality-sensitive hashing and stuff I don't want to get into right now because that's beyond the, not the topic. Okay. Okay. So here come LLMs, right? So LLMs are pre-trained on all code, so it's very different from actually somebody learning about something in one place and copying it to another. They take like all the code, right? Then that code, then they may actually make suggestions that are accepted by developers. So their summary of this all code goes back in to some pieces of the code. Then these pieces might have been copied. People learn from them, do something based on that, right? And as we know from prior work, not just prems, actually, LLM suggestions are so convincing that even if they're completely wrong, they're preferred to correct suggestions from actual humans, right? So they kind of so there's some real risk that stuff gets contaminated, right? So in summary, LLMs are software supply chain of type 4 because they're different from other supply chains, right? So they're trained on large created corpuses. They may be guided by developer actions as well through adversarial learning. People accept, not accept. But both inputs actually highly problematic, right? So, and then this code is being generated. So that's the supply chain transfer from LLMs back into the public repositories. Then, regular supply chains could be depended on, could be copied, could be learned from, or even fed back into another LLM that trains on it, right? So LLMs generate suggestion explanations to developers, so that's another problem. These explanations might seem convincing, but they're just fiction, right? So people get convinced in wrong things. So essentially, LLMs are propaganda for software developers as well, not just kind of more directed propaganda in election cases, right? So finally, it's very important point to note is that I'm really kind of like SSCs. Maybe you don't like them, but I really like measuring the supply chains, and LLMs really make it much, much harder for me to do a good job there. So that's another thing that I think it's worth noting. So why does it make it harder? So I think that that if we go back to this picture, you can see that now it's taking everything, producing some summary of everything in pieces, and then these pieces, and we still have the original complexity of the supply chain where pieces could be dependent upon, reused, and learned from. So yeah. So is LLM data, input data of high quality? Of course, we'll look into that, but some of it contains bugs. So obviously these bugs are learned as patterns, and then maybe suggested and introduced back into the code, and perhaps copied and so forth. There's some general opinions as well as work. So Salesforce CEO for some reason doesn't like Copilot, but there's up-level study that looks pretty good, even though it doesn't have too much detail. But they followed 800 developers. They found that LLM suggestion, they introduced 41% more bugs, the ones that used LLMs versus the ones that didn't. Suggestions were erroneous from security perspective, and again, things like they were so wrong but convincing, and so perhaps maintenance could be a nightmare because detecting bugs would be harder in well-formatted code. So essentially, LLMs are copy knowledge software supply chains on steroids, right? So, and it's kind of easy when you use the word artificial intelligence, right? Intelligence. If you repeat something 1,000 times, it becomes true. So people start thinking that there is intelligence. But actually, intelligence comes from training data. And I think that's a really important part. So one way to avoid problems with output is to avoid problems with input. Now, the problem, of course, is that yes, easy to say, use high-quality curated data. It's very expensive, right? So somehow you need to do auto-curation, and because of the need to have lots of data. So there's two options, right? So one is People who, probably most of you would say, hey, yeah, let's use LLMs to fix that pre-training data. But there could be problems with that because now the pre-training data is fixed, is generated, part of it is generated, so it could be a bit of a problem, right? Other options is much simpler. Actually, a lot of the data, if we look at supply chain from version control perspective, has been already fixed, right? It's just that people, 300 people that created whatever, or maybe 100 people, 100 authors on the Stack V2 data set creation, haven't really thought about the fact that, well, they're doing deduplication, but they're not doing very smart deduplication because when they do deduplication, they oftentimes pick buggy versions of the code when the fixed version is available. So instead of using any sort of LLMs, let's use actual developers with the full history of code evolution to find out which code versions are fixed and which ones are not fixed. And then if they are not fixed, fix them. So here's how it might look, right? So there's kind of this massive training data. It has bugs. But of course, many bugs have already been fixed. So let's just use these bugs that already been fixed to fix the training data, right? So in order to do that, of course, you need the entirety of OSS, all the commits, 5 billion of them and whatnot. You really need to improve the data quality. So again, World of Code helps with that, et cetera, et cetera. So make analysis run in minutes, not months. So all checks are checked. So let's take a look at a specific example. So there's a couple of data sets that are open, and they're widely used, as a matter of fact. In fact, many of the open models train only on the open data sets intentionally. So for example, Llama is not trained on any internal code at Meta because of the worries of revealing it and whatnot. So many of these open models are really intentionally focusing just on public data sets. So these Stack and Stack V2 are probably two of the most widely used code training, at least parts of the data set. So the Stack is an older version. It has 6 terabytes of data. Stack V2 has 67 terabytes of data, claims to have 600 languages. Again, it's a little bit BS, right? 600 languages, that just simply means there are 600 different file extensions, right? But anyway, it includes binaries, images, forked content, etc. Deduplicated collection is available as well. It's about half the size of the large collection, right? So let's take that data and see how much of that is crap. So before I explain that process, let me sort of remind you of how Git works. So Git has this concept of commit when you make a change, right? So commit has SHA-1. It points to the tree. And it has also parent tree. So tree is a folder, essentially, current folder, right? So when you compare two trees, in this case, we show just one tree. So it says README has SHA-1 blob with SHA-1 5B. License has blob with SHA-1 911. And then test RB has SHA-1 CBA, right? So then you look at the parent commit, and then it has also a tree. And then if you say, well, test RB, the SHA-1 is different, that means that file was modified as a result of that commit, right? So we can get essentially from the hierarchy of commit history, we can get also blob history by tracing which blobs changed at the same file name as the result of that history. So when we do that, so let's start from Stack V2. I didn't need to download Stack V2 because all I needed to have is SHA-1s of the blobs that were changed. All the blobs, of course, were already in the world of code. So it turns out that despite having 67 terabytes of data, this is only slightly more than 500 million blobs, right? So 500 million blobs is a tiny amount as compared to 26 billion blobs that are available, right? How good are these blobs? 74% are for files that have never been modified. So the file was created, never modified, right? That kind of is suspicious, right? If you use software, you realize that maybe in any software system, yes, go ahead.
I was wondering whether Stack V2 is intentionally not versioned, or is it supposed to be versioned?
No, it is supposed to be versioned. So it's extracted using from software heritage. And so they have exactly, know exactly which projects they have. They do a very good job in terms like if you find your code there and you don't like them to use it, you can write issue, they will remove it. So the next iteration of Stack v2 will not have the code that you object to being used, et cetera, et cetera. Did I answer your question? OK. So anyway, so most of the files are not changed. So if the file is not changed, probably it's irrelevant, either bad file, either it's a toy project, or something that's really suspicious. So most of the code there is really suspicious, right? So only 14%, which is half of the 26% that are left, that are modified, are at the latest version, right? So for modified files, only half are the latest version. 70% have 18% of all files there, or slightly 70% of the edited files are not have newer versions, right? So they did not bother to pick the latest version of the file, right? And out of those, 20% actually have commits that explicitly say fix, a correct fix bug problem, right? So we know that somebody went and fixed these files, right? And we know we can use World of Code to detect the fixed blob version. So I could run this. I have this list. I could basically, submit a commit once I have time to the Stack 2 and say, hey, could you go and please fix these files because they have been fixed and you have a bad version of it. Okay. So in summary, 140 million blobs have known fixes that they're not applied, right? So anyway, we can do the same thing with vulnerabilities. So this is an older work tried with Stack. So it was a smaller version. So we start with 3,000, 4,000 or so CVEs. We can also, for these, we can actually get commits. And so from the commits, we find which blobs were just before the fix, blobs after the fix. We can sort of extract all prior blobs, which are potentially vulnerable, all newer blobs, which are not, and then compare these lists to identify if the data is, if the stack contains vulnerable blobs or not. And here are some results. So just using World of Code, we from these 4,000 CVEs, we can find quite a million. That's pretty interesting. Quarter million. So these 4,000 CVEs lead to 250,000 potentially vulnerable blobs, right? So these, of course, CVEs are for actively managed projects. So these projects have long history. So if you start from the vulnerable blob, you can go back pretty far. So many of them are in the Stack dataset. Many of them are in deduped version of the Stack dataset. And even if we sort of look at just the blob just before the fix, even those are still in the Stack dataset. Okay, so here's the solving. Auto fix bugs. Just go through the training data, find out if it contains bugs, fix them, done. Okay. Okay. So I still have a little bit of time, and there's a bunch of other stuff I wanted to talk. So what I sort of covered is kind of described various types of supply chains in software and how they could be used to curate the data. There's some other stuff that I want to really briefly touch. It's not as mature, but I think it's important stuff that I'd like, if possible, anyone to kind of to collaborate on. So first aspect is data leakage, right? And it's a serious issue. Second is identifying LLM output in public repositories. I think it's important not just in terms to analyze, is it more maintainable, more correct, or less correct? From that perspective, but also from training new LLMs, from supply chain perspective for LLMs is also very important. And there are some promising techniques, but applying them at scale is a different story, right? Finally, the most interesting thing, I think, is actually if we actually get an identified generated code, is go back and say for each piece of generated code, which data samples in the training data that are most likely responsible for this generated code, right? So So that part is, if done, would complete the full supply chain cycle. And so we could see how different, like whether that responsible piece of code is secure or is not buggy and whatnot, and sort of have a better reasoning ability. So let's cover some of those very briefly before I open for questions, right? So idea of data leakage. Again, versions of the code could be very similar. So it could have 1,000 lines file, one token is changed, so you have new version, new blob, right? So of course, people do deduplication. You don't want to have 1,000 versions of the same, Linux include file, which has like only one character changes, because that would sort of overwhelm the model with the high frequency of the patterns seen in that file, right? So simplest way to do that is you basically say, well, if the blob is a parent or child blob of particular blob, then include the link. Add all these links into giant graph. Once you have that giant graph, basically find cliques, connected subsets, and then whenever you actually go and use data for training or testing, you basically make sure that your test sets are really in different cliques than the training sets, right? So fairly straightforward. It's not so easy. Obviously, there's a lot of simple blobs. People start with empty file and start to construct stuff, or people start with a template and then modify that template to create their website, for example, right? So there's lots of blobs that have a lot of descendants or parents, right? So we can exclude them from the graph. So for example, if we exclude blobs that have more than 10 either children or parent blobs, we still have the largest cluster has like 15 million blobs, right? So that's a lot. So I don't know. That's probably some Linux files. I need to investigate that. But so we still need to do a little bit better work on figuring out what these cliques are and how to sort of break them down further. You might be some community detection algorithm, et cetera, to do that. So, but most of them are much more reasonable. So you have much smaller pieces. If you go down the list, you would see that's maybe one or two only blobs in a clique. So here's how you kind of take that list of blobs, group them based on parent-child relationship, and then when you separate the test training sets, you sort of put them in different bins. So very briefly, I wanted to go over identifying generated code, right? So there's actually a variety of ways to do that. Like one way, you can actually ask ChatGPT, is this code generated or not? And it does a pretty good job. Now, as we know, these LLMs are very, very expensive. So you cannot go and ask for 26 billion blobs, is it generated or not? It's going to cost a lot of money. So fortunately, detecting generated code is much easier than generating code, right? So there's kind of like simple measures that you look at the conditional probabilities, and you end up that perplexity, of course, much lower for generated text than regular text. But again, you need to know some sort of idea of what these probabilities might be. For that, you might need the model, so it might be complicated. Now, other approaches involve language patterns and style. Turns out that actually content is not so important. But because text is written by people, they make, they have certain style which may be different from the style that these LLMs produce, right? Looking the techniques that look for factual errors, right? That people tend not to make, but LLMs tend to make. There's sort of more involved deep learning techniques. I won't go into the detail there. There's some n-gram techniques that, again, find these kind of lower perplexities for model-generated stuff. And in fact, if you think carefully, there's these attempts that look at, like spacing and sort of whether, spaces are put consistently, if there are too many spaces. And and LLM models, of course, produce stuff that's very, very good looking as opposed to actually manual models. So here's some references to that, including from Main Agapan and so forth. So the final point that I wanted to briefly mention is there's one more LLM idea. So unlike the source code as source code supply chain, LLM generated source code supply chain, LLMs by themselves have a supply chain, right? So LLMs are essentially long string of coefficients. And so they have parameters that used to train. Their model have hierarchies. If you go and look at Hugging Face, you'll see all sorts of ways that these models can be derived from other models. People do crazy stuff. Like, for example, they take one model, they take another model, they average coefficients. Turns out it works. Actually, it works like two models, right? Crazy stuff. But anyway, so there's all sorts of supply chain for LLMs themselves, of course, what it's trained on and so forth. Now, documentation, fortunately, is much more structured on Hugging Face than it is, if it exists, than it is on GitHub, because they have very good templates. People who use models know that you cannot just say this is the model. You need to say what data is trained, which parameters are. Hugging Face also allows you to do version control of the models and data. GitHub does not, because the models typically and data are too large to do version control on GitHub. You need to pay a lot of money. But Hugging Face, for now allows it for free, and so forth. So there's these, READMEs has links to source code. Again, not very common, but anyway, so that's yet another thing, which I didn't talk too much, but that's something that I'm working on, and anyone who's interested, I'd like to collaborate on that. So okay, summary. LLM output is only as good as input, may get over time because of user feedback and reuse of public generated code. Data curation, including these curriculum and other approaches that were mentioned, is maybe solution that's likely to work. There's lots of other stuff, lots of other dependencies that we can extract, mine, and use in order to sort of understand better how not just LLM as training inputs, but also LLM supply chain itself, how it works. And curation using supply chain may be a good way to address some of the problems, right? Identify problems in training data, in generated data, recognize generated data, recognize the extent of generated code. Anyway, there's tutorial. One more thing. There's, as pretty much every university we're hiring, we have 2 positions in whatever it means for national AI, so please go ahead and apply. I have a bunch of other illustrations, but I wanted to stop and open for questions.
Thanks for the amazing talk. Audris, this is huge. So you should be so busy that the LLM provider should be chasing after you, because you can fix this garbage in, garbage out sort of thing. Like, are they coming to you? Like, I'm surprised why they are not coming after you to help them to fix this.
So I could say 2 things, right? So. So there's a lot of licensing issues as well that sort of copy, even without LLMs, right? So that copy detection, highlights, right? And industry generally, my student kind of talked with some industry. They're actually happy with the current state of the things, because if they were aware that they could do better, they would need to do something, right? And so far, they're making a lot of money without actually investing a lot of effort in that. So so there's not that much interest, to tell you the truth. But I will submit these patches to the stack too. I'm pretty sure they will accept those. But yeah, anyway. Yeah. So so I think it's a double-edged sword, because it requires a lot of investment. There's maybe uptake. If it was a simple algorithmic change, people maybe took it over very quickly. But because it requires collection of the data, it's a bit more expensive.
But you still have like 100. You show like 140 million blobs that have been curated. Right. There are fixes, right? So it's not like.
So I could submit that to the stack. I'm pretty sure they would accept that. But figuring out how to do that, and am I rewarded for that? No. For giving talks? Yes. So who knows?
Well, you are doing something for the community, so that should be your reward, I guess.
Yeah,
so.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, great work. So I wonder because you're basically fixing code based on bug fix information. But what about, so that's the technical part of the ecosystem, the supply chain. What about the social part, like the identities, like developer identities, aliasing, and so on? Have you looked at ways to fix those automatically as well? Because they're probably more manual work involved.
Yeah, so there's, so I had a student did PhD thesis on that. Some of the algorithms are already implemented. Of course, they could be improved. So again, if you're, but the world of code already has aliasing that's done based on a variety of like behavioral fingerprinting, whatever it's called. But obviously there's ways to improve. So that's already done. I wasn't very clear. I mean, to some extent.
Let's have Prem first, maybe.
Yeah, I'll come over there.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Audris. Great talk as usual. So, so the question I have is, in general, is copying and blob duplication, the supply chains, has something to tell us about curriculum design, in the sense that if something is copied a lot, maybe it's more important for language models to learn about it. So is there some sense in which we should use these supply chain graphs to guide us in curriculum design?
I would wish so, right? So I'm a small little person with a limited time and limited time horizon too. Like in 20 years, I will say, where am I? Like what I'm doing here, but not quite yet. But getting closer to that. So yes, absolutely. So my idea is that this reuse would be a good quality indicator for the code. What I tried to do is also, and I haven't said that, but thank you for prompting me. One of the very surprise findings is, so you assume that when the copying occurs, it's only a few really famous projects that people copy code from into some dead bullshit nonsense, homework assignments, right? So turns out actually almost half of the code in the most active with 1,000 and more stars is copied from no-name, total inactive, single commit bullshit projects, right? So anyway, what the hell is going on? I don't know. So, but it's something that I think is, so idea is that, people copy code for obvious reasons. It's useful in some cases, right? Because otherwise, why would they copy it? So I think the idea is maybe that I like to work on is like, how can we support that better so that people at least know, where they copied that code, if there's fixes, they can get aware of that and so forth, and perhaps say, oh, this code has been copied a lot, therefore maybe it has some utility, and do some sort of recommendation. So I totally agree with you that that would be a fantastic way of applying this information to recommenders of various kind. Did I answer your question, by the way?
It did. Also, a side question. Have you done any analysis of how vulnerabilities go through your copying?
What probability?
The vulnerabilities, software SWEs.
Yeah, so there's a couple, 2-3 years ago, there's an ICSI paper. So basically introduced the concept of orphan vulnerabilities. So you have vulnerability that's fixed, right? So based on that, find all the copies of the code with vulnerability, but no fix, right? And then even submit patches to those projects. Most of them just didn't bother to respond, but only maybe out of 100, maybe 2 or 3 responded. But there's plenty of orphan vulnerabilities. And people don't care because you say, well, this orphan vulnerability is an active project. The reality is, you find a project, looks like it does what you need, you just copy stuff, right? So just to be even more extreme, right? Android has a JPEG vulnerability they fixed. It didn't tell the upstream project that they fixed that vulnerability, right? So we actually had to tell that upstream project that, look, these Android guys fixed the vulnerability, didn't bother to tell you, so why don't you apply the patch? But anyway, so it's all sorts of crazy stuff happening.
So I had a question, Audris, May here. I had a question, but I want to kind of comment on something that Prem asked just now and what you said. One of the reasons in work that we've done, we actually reached out to developers, and one of the most common feedback we get is, yes, that looks like a vulnerable piece of code, but there is no way that any kind of user input will ever reach that piece of code in the way that you imagine it is, right? Especially in Android apps and things. They go, this requires a text input, and my app has no text boxes at all. so I don't care and I'm not going to fix it.
Yeah, so very good point. So a lot of static analysis suggestions, right, are unreachable, never realizing. Fixing them will make code complicated, hard to maintain, forget it, right? So sometimes I'm sorry to say that, sometimes aloud, it's recorded, yeah. So it's better to have buggy code, but that's easy to maintain, than actually, absolutely correct code that's impossible to read through, right? So I totally agree with you. The examples I gave, these are vulnerabilities that actually have been fixed, so they're known, exploited, and fixed. Maybe in that another context, they cannot be exploited and fixed, right? I don't know. The point is that in many cases, the projects are, the software is very similar, so probably they might be actually still exploitable. So I'm not, but in this case, it's not static analysis warning, it's actual, fixed vulnerability that I'm talking about.
So my question is more a clarification question followed by a question itself, is that the Stack v2 data set, when they created it, was there already a new version available, or were they using versions that were the latest versions at that time? But since then, there has been fixed versions of it.
Yeah, so the latest version is about the same version on which I'm comparing, same version of World of Code of the similar dates. So also, I'm not really taking much later version of World of Code and say, hey, this is an obsolete data. Obviously, you can use the newer data to even find more bugs, right? But this is about the same data. I think the issue there is that they have like 100, they use standard deduplication techniques, which presumably do some NILSMA hashing or whatever, and so excluding stuff that is too similar. But not taking into attention the fact that there's version history, because perhaps they did not have ability, the World of Code infrastructure to use to do that, right? So I don't think it's going to be more applicable to web pages, because web pages are not version controlled, so you don't know which ones are fixed, which are not. But I think for code, it makes sense to incorporate that. Hopefully, Stack v3 will use World of Code information to fix that.
Okay.
So one more question, one last question right here.
Thanks for the talks. So you presented a lot of really interesting statistics, one of which was talking about edits of files. For example, I think you mentioned that 74% of files in Stack v2 were never edited. I was curious kind of what we should expect there, or like what would be the target there in kind of optimal code for LLM training, because it seems like if something's edited a ton, it's probably not very good code, and some files we know are probably not going to be edited because they're just committed.
Yeah. So great question. So just to get back to you, so one of my really old, most influential kind of discoveries is that code with no bugs is probably the worst code ever, because it's never been used. So it's actually the opposite, that the more changes are there, the more fixes are there, the more likely the code is actually really, really good, because it's been used in a huge number of cases, right? So that's kind of the heuristic that I'm using, saying it hasn't been changed. We don't know if it's any good, right? Because probably it's not been even executed at all, right? Or executed in cases where people would bother to respond. Now, you asked another very good question. What level makes, is a good level, right? So, and I don't really have the answer to that. So what they do in the Stack v2, they are aware that there's good, better, and good and worse code, but they use like really superficial indicators like stars on GitHub or something like that to really filter out the projects that they include versus exclude, which aren't necessarily really a good measure of like. So I would say that's a good, really excellent research question, saying, is it really true, this finding, at least I found in commercial software, that if you don't have bugs, that's really, really bad sign. That means that if you use that code the code is going to be used, it's going to be complete nightmare, right? So that's kind of the question. I don't know if that answer is true for open source or not, and where that balance is, I really don't know. But
Okay, let's thank Audris for the amazing presentation. Thank you.